Hello and welcome to the Heaven Bound Sunday School class at the First General Baptist Church in Truman. The lesson this week comes from 2 Samuel chapter 9. Our scripture passage tells the story of extraordinary kindness. It's the story of a powerful king who reached out and extended special kindness to a young man who neither earned nor deserved that kindness. The king's kindness came as a total surprise to him. It's a story that teaches us important lessons about the power of kindness. It also reminds us of God's great kindness to us and how that should impact our lives. Now, Samuel was the last of the judges. He was well respected among the people. He was succeeded by his sons. They weren't like their father. The people did not respect them, did not like them, and it just started up the discussion that had been going on for a while. As people looked around and looked at other nations, they all had kings. And the Israelites started saying, why can't we have a king for Israel? Saul was chosen as king. He was not faithful to God. He wasn't a very good king and actually was eventually rejected by God. That's a whole different story, though, from what today's scripture passage tells us, but we need to know a little bit about that. Samuel appointed or anointed David to follow Saul, and then Saul was jealous of David. Saul's son Jonathan was one of David's best friend, or I guess you could say his very best friend. And yet for all of Saul's paranoid attacks on David, David consistently refused to harm or retaliate against Saul. In spite of his complicated interaction with Saul, David's most loyal and trusted friend was none other than Saul's oldest son, Jonathan. Their friendship resulted in a covenant that obligated both parties. Jonathan would protect and support David, while David pledged to show kindness to Jonathan's family. And that's the crux of our scripture today. And I'll read that now from 2 Samuel 9, starting with the very first verse. David asked, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. They summoned him to appear before David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" "At your service," he replied. The king asked, "Is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness?" Ziba answered the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet." "Where is he?" the king asked. Ziba answered, "He's at the house of Machir, son of Amiel in Lo-debar." So King David had him brought from Lo-debar, from the house of Machir, son of Amiel. When Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. David said, "Mephibosheth?" I don't know why he couldn't have been named Jonathan Jr. "At your service," he replied. "Don't be afraid," David said to him, "for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." Then the king summoned Ziba, Saul's steward, and said to him, "I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops, so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, "Your servant will do whatever my lord the king commands his servant to do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah, and all the members of Ziba's household were servants. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table, and he was lame in both feet. So David wanted to repay that kindness, and part of that covenant that he'd had with his most loyal and best friend that he had ever had, Jonathan, was always to care and show kindness to his family. So David was reminded of this. He asked the question, is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness? And as he's going to show kindness for Jonathan's sake. And eventually someone mentioned that there was a man named Ziba that was a servant in Saul's household and was kind of a caretaker, taking care of all of Saul's property. So David summoned him, asked him the same question, is there anyone out there that I can show them God's kindness? A repetition of the question just emphasizes David's urgent desire to show kindness. And so the answer from Ziba was yes, that Jonathan has a son and he's lame in both feet. David asked where he was. He was told where he was, and he summoned him. Now, the boy had been 5 years old when Jonathan had been killed in battle. And the story was that a nurse was holding the child when they heard news of Jonathan's death. And the nurse became frightened, began to run, somehow tripped and dropped Jonathan, and that's how he damaged his feet, and he was no longer able to walk. He was lame in both feet. So Mephibosheth, he is brought to David. He comes in, he bows down to pay him honor. So he knelt down, bowed down to David, and paid honor to David. And David's response, do not be afraid, because he's been summoned before the king. He had really no idea what it was all about. And so David reassured him by saying, do not be afraid. Now David told Mephibosheth he would fulfill his covenant of kindness to Jonathan in two ways. First, he would restore to him the land that belonged to Saul. David would restore to him all the farmland that belonged to Saul. Restoring the farmland was a wonderful gift. Land was vitally important in those days and the most crucial resource for financial security. Secondly, David told him that he would always eat at his table. What an incredible act of kindness. Being invited to eat once at the king's table would be an amazing privilege. Eating at the king's table would be an amazing privilege. Eating at the king's table was usually reserved for the king's family and a few close associates. Jonathan's son was astonished and grateful, and he thanked him. David summoned Ziba to him and told him what he had done. He said, I've given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family, and you and your family and your servants. And the fact that Ziba had so many servants kind of gives you the idea that he had profited mightily from tending to Saul's property. But David's telling him, you're going to tend to the crops and make sure that he's taken care of. And Ziba pledged his loyalty to David and said he would honor those decisions. What lessons can be learned from this passage? First, there is the lesson of sowing and reaping. What goes around comes around. The kindnesses you show to others will somehow be rewarded, whether in your life or your children's life. Second, there's the lesson of faithfulness. We should be faithful to keep our promises. David made a covenant with Jonathan and then made sure he kept his word, even though Jonathan had already passed away. Third, there is the lesson of stewardship. When God blesses you with power, wealth, or influence, you should use that to bless others. You are blessed to be a blessing. Fourth, there is the lesson of mercy. As recipients of God's kindness, we should show God's kindness to others. David never lost sight of the grace God had shown him. Now he passed it on to others. And fifth, there's the lesson of humility. We should never view ourselves as worthy of God's kindness. We are sinners saved by grace. Just like Mephibosheth, we should not presume that God owes us anything. Who am I that God should notice me? Just as David showered Mephibosheth kindness for Jonathan's sake, God shows us kindness for Jesus' sake. Finally, this whole passage is a beautiful picture of God's grace. Like Mephibosheth, we also are lame. We are crippled by sin, unable to provide for ourselves and covered with shame. We also were barred from the king's table, and just like David extended kindness to Jonathan's son, our God has extended an extraordinary kindness to us, one that is completely unearned and undeserved. He has invited us to eat at the king's table always.